Today's the 18th anniversary of 9/11, and I thought I should say something to say today because it's been a big date in my life, even though it happened toward the end. It changed my teaching focus, it changed a lot of my research focus, and I've been doing a lot more on the Middle East than I had before then. And it was, for me, the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. It was a day that will live in infamy. It's one of the handful of days that I'll never forget, and I'll always remember where I was. And I know I'm not anywhere like alone with that. I mean, the first date that sticks in my mind was seventh grade when President Kennedy was assassinated. I still remember I was sitting in Miss Yetman's class at St. Anselm, and I remember Mother Superior's voice came over the loudspeaker and said that President Kennedy had been shot. And I remember thinking, no, he's dead. I just had that feeling. And I remember a few days later, I was at a friend of mine, Jim Serpiello, I was at his accordion concert recital. And I had been backstage with him to keep him company so he didn't get nervous. And he was getting ready to go on, and they told me to go back out and join my parents and his parents in the audience. And as I was walking out, there were a bunch of men gathered around a card table, and they had a tiny little TV on the card table. And they were saying they're bringing him out. And I said, bringing who out? And they said, Oswald, the guy who assassinated Kennedy. And they were bringing him out to transport him somewhere. So I stood and I watched and I waited. And as I'm watching, he gets shot. I mean, on live TV, I saw Lee Harvey Oswald shoot him. And I'll never forget that day. And then the next day that I'll never forget was 9/11. I was in my office working in Brewster. I was chair of a history department then, and I got a news flash on my computer screen, news alert from CNN. Yeah, CNN. Those are the days when CNN was the trusted, brand of news. And it said that a plane had flew into one of the Twin Towers in New York. And my first thought was, what an idiot, who screwed that up? Because it happened before. I knew that in World War II, a B-25, Army Air Corps B-25 had flown into the Empire State Building. So I knew that was entirely possible that somebody could make a mistake and fly into one of these big buildings. I mean, it was clear in Greenville. I had no idea what the weather was like in New York. But then a bit later, I kept working, and boom, another alert came up, and a second plane had flown into the second tower. And I thought, oh no, that's not enough. You don't have two accidents like that in one day. And as I was mulling that over, people started gathering in the hallway outside my office. In those days, we had 3 administrative assistants and undergraduate students. There were 4 people out there, and some of the faculty had come down, and they were all gathering out there, and they were all talking. They had seen it or heard it or gotten calls from home that somebody had been watching it and had seen it happen. So I walked out and I joined them. And I remember one, I don't know which secretary it was, it may have been Shirley Martin, said, who would do this? Who would do something like this? And I said, I know. And I walked back into my office. I'll never forget, I opened my drawer and I pulled out a folder that I had been keeping since 1997, I think. And I came out and I held up the folder and I said, here's the guy who did it, Osama bin Laden. And of course, none of them had ever heard of him, but I had been watching this guy for years. Remember, I'm not in intelligence or something. I'm the chair of a history department in Greenville, North Carolina. And I had a folder on this guy. And in the folder, oddly enough, was a transcript of an interview, I think from 1998, that he had done with an ABC reporter for the show 2020. The reporter's name was John Miller. And it was a really interesting interview for 2 reasons. One, it was one of the few interviews you had with an American journalist in English, with translations of Osama bin Laden. It was a rare look into this guy. But the other thing that had blown me away when I watched the interview was bin Laden was, looking away all the time. He's a very strange guy. And everything was anti-Semitism. The second half of the interview, the Jews control the world, the Jews are doing this, Jews, 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 Jews. And then Miller, the ABC News reporter, and this is why I thought this thing was so inane, said to him, in many ways, you're like a Middle East Teddy Roosevelt. So here's a guy from 2020, ABC News, John Miller, comparing the guy who just blew up the Twin Towers to a Middle East version of Teddy Roosevelt. And that's after he had launched into all these anti-Semitic diatribes. And I thought, yeah, like Teddy Roosevelt, well-known, rabid anti-Semite in American history. So anyway, I got back to my office and I thought, I wonder if that's still there, because I was thinking about sending people to it. So I went to the ABC news site, and sure enough, I found the transcript, and I read through the transcript, and guess what they had done? They had cut off the end of it where he asked the guy. This is right after, a couple hours after 9/11. ABC News cut off the part where he had compared him to Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know if they ever put it back again, but there it was. But I had the transcript before they sabotaged it to protect their image. I should add that John Miller today is, I think, an anti-terrorism official in de Blasio's government in New York City, the city government. He's one of their terrorism experts. This is the guy who compared Osama bin Laden to Teddy Roosevelt, is now an anti-terrorism expert in the United States. So that's my memory of 9/11. And the shame of it is, I mean, I knew it was him right away, and I didn't have a clearance. I'm not sitting in Washington D.C. I don't have access to all this information. It was clear to me, but it took the government, a couple of days to be sure what, who it was. But I had no doubt about it. And of course, right off the bat, the government, the Bush administration. I mean, when I say government, I'm not talking about Barack Obama or any of that crap. This is George W. Bush. Bush started doing things. He started lying to people, cover up what had happened. I'm not talking about who brought it down or anything like that. But it made a concerted effort. There were three things they had to do. One, they had to answer it. They had to do something, and Bush did things. But the other two things they were worried about, one was, I saw Carl, whatever his name is, on TV today, and he said the same thing. They were worried about what people might do to Muslims. That there might be this backlash, people go out and start beating up Muslims, or people might turn on our Muslim allies, which was complicated foreign policy. So they went after all three things. And one of the things they did was to isolate Islam from what had happened. And the way they did that, and I've talked about this before in other videos, they knew, just as I knew, that in June 2001, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden's group, had merged with Ayman al-Zawahiri's group, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and they had renamed the group Qaeda al-Jihad. So the group that brought down the Twin Towers was Qaeda al-Jihad, not Al-Qaeda. But they didn't want to say that, because their strategy was to name him a terrorist. Terrorist was a good choice for them, because a terrorist can be anybody. You can be an American terrorist, an Irish terrorist, a German terrorist, a French terrorist, an Italian terrorist, a Japanese terrorist. Anybody can be a terrorist. But these guys weren't terrorists. They used terror as a tactic, but they were jihadists. That's what they considered themselves, jihadists. If you asked bin Laden, was he a terrorist, he would say no, and he's right, because he's a jihadist. Bush called him a terrorist, because terrorism doesn't mean anything other than that you're a terrorist. If they had called him a jihadist, after all, the guy's head of a group called Qaeda al-Jihad, the base for jihad. And if they had called the guy a jihadist, you have to be a Muslim to be a jihadist. So they didn't want any part of that. Of course, the Muslim community was right in there saying, oh, jihad can mean being a better Muslim, being a better doctor, being a better student, being a better blah, 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 blah. All which is true, but it's beside the point. Osama bin Laden was trying to be a better Muslim, but his interpretation of how you be a better Muslim is by fighting for Allah. Jihad beat Saif, which, fighting through struggle against the infidels, which is what they were doing. But they didn't want us to know that. And then, of course, the other thing Bush did, which has been continued ever since, is this myth that these guys had hijacked Islam. Osama bin Laden no more hijacked Islam than John Calvin hijacked Christianity. Oh, well, bin Laden has no authority to issue fatwas and religious decrees. Bin Laden has no authority to reinterpret 13,000 years of Islamic interpretations. Well, John Calvin, or Martin Luther for that matter, had no right to reinterpret Catholic doctrine after 1,500 years. They had no right to issue decrees that they issued. They had no right to reinterpret Christianity. But they didn't hijack Christianity. They were an interpretive stream of Islam, a legitimate interpretive stream of Christianity, I mean. And so was bin Laden. Bin Laden represents a legitimate interpretive stream of Islam. It's been around for a long time, in the modern sense, the last 90 years. And every generation, they're more numerous and more extreme. But if we don't recognize that, we can't deal with it. And we haven't been able to recognize that because of what Bush did. Bush just sidestepped the whole issue and labeled them as terrorists and said they had nothing to do with Islam. And we haven't been able to deal with it since. That's why somebody like John Miller, who said something about as idiotic as you could get to a mass murderer, Osama bin Laden, you're like a Middle East version of Teddy Roosevelt, could today be considered an anti-terrorism official, because this is this crap that we're dealing with today. I wrote a book, The Last Crusade, and it was published. I wrote it about 12 years ago. It was published 13 years ago. And or I wrote it 13 years ago. It was published 12 years ago. And I ended it. This is the last sentence in the book. The last sentence. The abyss beckons, and the disunity of the West only deepens that chasm. And my second book I was going to write, which nobody ever wanted to publish. There was proposals for it out there somewhere, or I have them, but nobody would even touch it. But I saw the abyss that was coming 13 years ago. And I knew what needed to be done to prevent it from us getting closer to the abyss until the point where we fell in. And, what was the abyss? Well, I sort of hinted at what it was. And I wrote that I talked about it right before this had happened. Hezbollah, one of these Lebanese Shia terrorists, who had murdered an American, Robert Dean Stephan, beat him to death, thrown him out of a plane, had been imprisoned in Germany, and the Germans had let him go. They had released him because a couple of their citizens were kidnapped in Iraq. So to get them back, they released the guy who had killed Stephan, and nobody really said much of anything about it. And I said, who would think that one day, the Germans, a Germany willing to secure the freedom of one of its citizens kidnapped in Iraq by releasing a Hezbollah terrorist who murdered Robert Dean Stephan, the American to whom my book was dedicated, could one day intern Muslims in camps? Never, you say. And then this is where the abyss comes. Who in the 1920s would have believed that a people who had produced Bach, Beethoven, Schiller, and Goethe would one day establish camps at Dachau, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Birkenau? The abyss beckons, and the disunity of the West only deepens the chasm. That's what I saw coming. And since then, the disunity of the West has only gotten worse. And in the face of the disunity of the West, the response of the Islamic world has been predictable. They're not doing much of anything about what's happening. And the problem keeps spreading. As I said earlier, if you look at modern political jihadism since the 1920s, which is when it began in Egypt and British India, since the 1920s, each generation, they've been more numerous and more extreme. And there's no end to that. They're still around. They're still becoming more numerous. And they're going to get more extreme. And more extreme means eventually they'll do something it'll be a nuclear 9/11. It's not a question in my mind of if, it's a question of when. Sooner or later, they will get there. And the other thing that we're doing today, which isn't the fault of the Bush administration, is we're going back to our policy focus that we had before the end of the Clinton administration. During the administration of Bill Clinton, and before that, George Herbert Walker Bush, and before that, even Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, we had always viewed terrorism as, even coming out of the Islamic world, as A, terrorism, and as B, one of a number of problems, like the global drug trade, human trafficking, what today we call climate change. In those days, it was environmental challenges, international organized crime, money laundering. It was basically a criminal justice problem. And that's the way it was through most of the Clinton administration. To his credit, at the end of the Clinton administration, policy changed in the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, and they began to focus on the jihadist threat as a separate individual, but still a terrorist threat. They actually started setting up focused groups in the national security establishment to address it. Now, of course, Clinton never got to do much of anything about that because he soon left office. But you had those big events in Kenya and with the coal bombing that did flip the switch in Clinton's head, and they began to realize that this is something wholly other. This isn't just one of a group of problems. Among them, like one of the things I didn't mention was domestic terrorism, the Tim McVeigh issue, which had happened during the Clinton administration. So at the end of the Clinton administration, that starts to shift, and they start seeing this jihadist threat as something different, something more dangerous. Because it wasn't just dangerous to us. It wasn't just what they would do to us. It was what they were doing around the world. Whereas if you look at the domestic terrorist threat, the Tim McVeigh threat, that could be dangerous, but it would only be dangerous here. It wasn't going to be dangerous everywhere else in the world. And you weren't going to have anything like 3,000 dead, almost 3,000 dead in 9/11. What's happening today, I don't know if anybody notices, maybe it's just me, but we're going back to where we were before the end of the Clinton administration. We're focused, primary focus is climate change. We're focused on domestic terrorism. We're focused on, white supremacy. We're focused on drug trade. We're focused on all these other things. And that means, what that means in practical terms is the FBI is less focused today than they were 2 years ago on jihadist threats. They can't, if there's only so many, FBI agents, they only have so much attention to spend. And if they're spending it more on hunting down, people in Charlottesville that they think are going to, run over people at meetings or something like that, which is good, they should be doing that. But if they're doing that, they're not doing something else. And the question is, what are they not doing? And we won't know what they're not doing until the shit hits the fan. And then there'll be an investigation and somebody will say, well, they redirected their efforts to look after domestic terrorism because of blah, 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 and gun violence and all these other things. In other words, what I'm saying is we're taking our eye off the ball. And in many ways, we've been doing that since 9/11. And, the big lot of the blame goes to George Bush. He didn't let us focus entirely on the ball. He always kept the ball moving so it was blurry and we never got to focus on it. And all that's come home to roost today because we've totally lost our focus now. And we're focusing on climate change, we're focusing on this, we're focusing on that, and we're not focusing on the jihadist threat. And when they do, get in, and hopefully it won't be as bad as 9/11, and God forbid, I hope it's not worse, but something's going to happen, somewhere down the road, and then everybody will be wringing their hands and launching an investigation into why did this happen? How did this happen? Just as we did with the 9/11 Commission. How did that happen? And because, we weren't focused, because we weren't paying attention, because we were looking for other things, because, people didn't want to see, people saw things, but they didn't want to say things. And that's the way it is today. People are afraid to say anything. You had the woman who thought there was weird things going on in San Bernardino, but she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to be accused of being an Islamophobe. So she kept their mouth shut. And, that's where we're at. And the best we can do is pray that somebody doesn't sneak through and do something particularly heinous again, because it's in all likelihood they're going to try and hopefully they'll fail. But if not, then we'll do another investigation and we'll reinvent the wheel and understand that we weren't paying attention, because we're not. We're not focused. Nobody wants to focus. If you want to focus, you're not allowed to focus. Like I said, the second book in this 2-book series never got published because they decided they didn't want to do it. As the editor said to me in person in a meeting in Washington, we don't want to see our editorial offices bombed. That's actually what he said to me. It was fear that they would get attacked if they published something that, said what I thought was the truth and what he thought was a very, powerful message I was going to try to deliver in the book. And, proposals I've given for articles or to give papers at conferences have been rejected one after the other. Places that I thought I could go to and know, oh, they'll publish this. They published everything I've written. Nope, nothing. Thrown down, articles, panels rejected. Nobody wants to let me say anything. So that's fine. But, it doesn't mean that the things I'm saying aren't true. It just means that, nobody wants to hear them. And those are when you don't want to hear the truth, that's when you can't possibly combat it. If you don't understand it, you don't embrace it, you don't address it clearly, succinctly, honestly, you can't possibly take care of it. And that's where we're at today. Keep in mind when the Arabs invaded the Iberian Peninsula in the early 700s, a conflict started between the Christians and the Muslims. To some extent it was on and off, but it was pretty much a perpetual, not a multi-generational conflict that lasted until 1492. It lasted close to 800 years, what the Spanish called the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. 800 years. That's what we're talking about here. This is something that's going to go away in your lifetime or your kid's lifetime. When I teach my course in the U.S. and Middle East, and I've taught it every year, at least once a year since 2003, I started off the same way every year. And I tell the kids, in those days, they were, this is 15, 16 years ago. These kids are, pushing 40 now. Some are older. And I tell them, you will not live to see the end of this. However you want to define it. A war, a conflict, whatever you want to call it. That this war with the jihadists, you will not live to see the end of this. And that's my message to all of you and your children, probably your grandchildren. You're not going to live to see the end of this. So the first thing you need to do is to understand what in the hell is going on.